everyone. I'm Leslie Van Zandt, Chief Advancement Officer at WAMU. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the March Diane Rehm Book Club. Today, Diane is joined by Scott Turow for a discussion of his latest legal thriller, Presumed Guilty. In it, we once again encounter Rusty Sabich, the prosecutor accused of killing his mistress, who we first met in Turow's 1987 blockbuster, Presumed Innocent. Now he is 76 and retired. Until, that is, his fiance's son is accused of murder. What ensues is a trial filled with twists and turns and questions about whether justice can ever really be served. Everything you'd expect from a novelist who set the gold standard when it comes to modern courtroom dramas. It's a pleasure to welcome him here today. Before the conversation starts, a few reminders. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so using the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to use the closed captioning, please click on the CC button, which is also found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Everything we do at WAMU is made possible by your support. If you enjoy the discussion today, please consider making a gift online by visiting wamu.org/donate. And now, here's Diane and Scott Turow.
And Scott Turow, what a pleasure to see you again. This is actually the 5th time you and I have had a conversation about one of your brilliant books. So it's great to see you.
Well, thank you, Diane. It's wonderful to be with you again. I remember our first interviews in person, and I was so struck by your personal presence, and so it's a lot of fun to be with you again.
Thank you. You're back to Rusty Sabich, and Rusty is someone that you really, really drew into, a man who not only was accused of murder, he had a lovely wife, a family. It was tough on him. Now we see him again, but in a very, very different setting. Tell us a little about where he is and who he is now.
Well, Presumed Guilty is the 3rd book I've written about Rusty. At the end of the 2nd, which was called Innocent, his life was kind of a wreck. His wife was dead. He was just out of prison. And he had resolved that he was going to go about 100 miles north of the fictional Kendall County and just live as a hermit at a family cabin where he and his wife and his son had, often passed time in the summers. And so he headed to this, again, another imaginary county, this one called Scagin County. And as the book opens, he recounts for us that whatever his intention, he's slowly been drawn back into life. He's now, as a former judge, working as an arbitrator and a mediator. More significant to Rusty, who feels that he made a complete hash of his earlier life, he's started a relationship with a woman named B. Mena, who's a good deal younger than he is. She's the local school principal. And by his measure, and seemingly from B's, they've had a very successful relationship.
Yes.
The one issue, which he knew from the start, he was wise enough to know you can't part a mother from her child. B has an adopted son, Aaron Housley, who had been adopted with B's husband or ex-husband. And Aaron has had substantial difficulties growing up. He's on probation now for a felony drug possession charge. And one of the conditions of the probation is that he has to live under B and Rusty's roof. That's where we begin. The novel begins when Aaron, the son, the adopted son, has just disappeared.
And he has disappeared because he's gone off with his girlfriend. And his girlfriend comes from a very prominent family in that county. They do not approve of the relationship between the son and the girlfriend. And then, out of the blue, she, the girlfriend, is found dead.
Correct.
And Rusty, as you said, a retired judge who's now acting as an arbitrator, is urged by B to take on his case. Tell us about the difficulty that Rusty goes through to make that decision.
Well, when B suggests to Rusty that he should be the person to represent Aaron, he laughs at her because he thinks the idea of defending somebody who's soon going to be a member of his family, he and B are engaged, is something that the law does not recommend. And B says to Rusty something that he finds incredibly ominous, which is, oh, you're the perfect person for the job because you know what it's like to have been accused of murder when you're innocent and didn't do it. And Rusty, who, of course, is a veteran of the criminal justice system, is well aware that most defendants, whatever their protestations, prove to be guilty. And of course, that's very much his fear about Aaron. And he argues with B, says, we'll find a better lawyer. There are people out there who are much more experienced defending murder cases. But it turns out that in the rural counties where the crime occurred, there are very few murders and very few people experienced in defending those cases. Indeed, the most prominent example of somebody successfully defending a murder case is the woman who's now sitting as the judge on Aaron's prosecution. So it slowly becomes clear that Rusty has a number of advantages as a defense lawyer. He's doesn't have an urban air any longer since he's been living in this rural area for 15 years now. And there's a lot of hostility to urban lawyers up there. And as he also says, he's going to work cheap, namely for free.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
the cost of a defense in a murder case, he knows, would literally break his fiance and her ex-husband, not to mention leaving Aaron in debt for the rest of his life, assuming that he
And
was
the one
lucky enough to
thing,
get free.
the one thing you haven't mentioned, we haven't mentioned, is that Aaron is a Black young man.
Right.
And the county looked somewhat disapprovingly when B and her husband adopted this child. And that is another complication because Rusty is very concerned about how this community is going to select a jury that's going to treat this young man fairly. Tell us a little about May, his girlfriend.
Well, you said before that May's family didn't approve of her relationship with Aaron. It
Right.
goes the other way too. B is particularly hostile to May, who she thinks is really trying to bring Aaron down to her level and wreck his life and his future. Um, so, this is, but May is a charismatic figure in many ways. And I'm tempted to say charismatic as people with great emotional difficulties frequently are. And she is, when she wants to be, incredibly charming. She's unquestionably brilliant, and she's beautiful, uh, and and very canny. And Aaron finds their relationship incredibly precious. Um, Although he's found in Skagen County, or the county to the north where he's being tried, Marengo County, um, an almost unrelenting race consciousness. He really feels that May is um, one of the few people who really regards him as Aaron, that their relationship, he compares her attitude toward his being black like his attitude toward the fact that she's blonde. And yes, that gains attention from other people, but it really doesn't mean much in the context of their relationship. And as he says, there's nobody else in his life like May. And it's been very hard for him to shirk this high school romance, even though everybody else sees the incredibly destructive aspects on both sides of this relationship.
And the young woman is incredibly quixotic. You
Yes,
never really know how she's going to behave toward Aaron and other people
right.
from one moment to the next, which makes that relationship that much more difficult. What Why did you decide that Rusty should go back into court?
Well, this goes into the complicated calculus by which novels arise. Um, for many years, I'd had a desire to go back to Rusty in this new location. And I've owned a house in southeastern Wisconsin for more than 30 years. And I'm not really a local, no matter how long I've been up there. But I've watched carefully, and this rural slash ex-urban life is a difficult one for the people there. One element of it that's always been really striking to me is um, there's not really a lot of economic opportunities for the young people who grow up there. Even if you're going to take over the family farm, what happens to the other kids? Because that farm has been supporting one family, and that's probably all it can support. Um, and so you're basically raising your children to go away. And that happens to many of us, of course, but it's not the assumption that they're going to have to leave, which is true in that area. And that the kids end up feeling disconnected. Um, there's more than the usual share of misbehavior among the teenagers. It's it's got a weird vibe, and the big thing is that as far as the trial is concerned, is the people up there really assume that um, everybody else in the country doesn't give a damn about them, that certainly not in the cities. And so they've become increasingly hostile to urban people. So I wanted to write about that. That was one thing. I'd also been fascinated over the years by the theme of what happens in a family when one of the members is suspected of a serious crime. And I've loved a number of these books, Bill Landay's Defending Jacob, and my friend Rose Ellen Brown's Before and After. And much as I would like to have just copied my friends, I wanted to make it my own. And when I suddenly hit this idea that, wait a minute, Rusty can be a defense lawyer, he's never done that. That's when the book really became alive in my mind. And so, and that's how the plot evolved.
He's always been first a successful prosecuting attorney, and then with a number of judgeships that he enjoyed doing, which then took him into this field of arbitration, which he was quite comfortable with. But the idea of becoming a defense lawyer throws him into really a whole other way of thinking. And what I love about not only this book, but your other books, is that you're teaching us about the law as you move along. You taught us through presumed innocent. You are teaching us here about exactly how the law works. When there is a motion, you take the moment to explain that motion. You talk about choosing a jury and how that defense lawyer works with the jury advisor. Is what you set out to do with these books to teach us about the law and how it works.
Well, I'm not the originator of the idea. Aristotle said that the purpose of art is to enlighten and to entertain. And I took a course when I was a graduate student at Stanford from a man named Ian Watt, who wrote scholarship about the birth of the novel in the 18th century. And he said, fundamentally, the novel's purpose then, and it's retained it, was educational. It was particularly to educate women who were newly freed in the 18th century, the genteel class, from the need to work outside the home. And so it was to teach them about the manners of the class in which they were about to enter. And there's always been an educational component to the novels. But I agree with what you're saying, Diane, that the American interest in the law, which probably reached its zenith around the time that Presumed Innocent was published in the late 1980s, has made people curious. And, to some extent, I am relying in Presumed Guilty on the growing sophistication of the American reading audience
Yes.
about legal matters. And so some of the basics no longer need to be explained. I've taken a great deal of pleasure in the number of particularly trial lawyers who have lived this life, who've written to me about, the what they judge to be the incredible accuracy of this book, and probably unlike any other in its portrayal of the process of trying a lawsuit. But I wouldn't have been able to do that, I think, 30 years ago. But I now am lucky enough to have a more patient readership.
It's interesting because that's the very question from Patty, who asks, do you take liberties with the law, or is what you write really how it works?
Well, sort of my great revelation, I had been a writing fellow at Stanford, and those were difficult years for me, largely because I couldn't quite figure out what kind of writer I should be and what I wanted to accomplish. And I was standing in a courtroom, I'd say roughly in 1982, and it suddenly dawned on me that the goal that I'd espoused at Stanford, namely that a great novel should be of interest to both an English professor and a bus driver, that when I looked around the courtroom in a criminal case that was going on, I realized, well, here was a subject that clearly of broad interest: crime and deviation, detection, proof, how we find the truth. All of those themes attract a broad audience. And my perspective, just to answer Patty's question, has always been that those people were sitting in that courtroom fascinated, um, because the process itself is always fascinating.
Yes.
And I thought that was what I was, one of the things I was after in Presumed Guilty, was that if you can do it the right way, if you don't have to take it upon yourself to lecture or bore people to death, they can understand why the things you mentioned, Diane, just filing a motion, or whether or not you make a serious motion for a mistrial, or what calculations go into picking a jury. You can do that with fundamental accuracy. Now, there's no question that I shorthand certain things and compress them. I don't spend a lot of time in the novel on jury selection, which, by the terms of the novel, went on for a day and a half. But I try not to cheat on things like the evidentiary rulings or the requirements of the law. And that has, I think, earned me a devoted readership, particularly among lawyers.
I agree. And you might just talk about how you wrote Presumed Innocent as you traveled to and from your office.
Yeah, I had promised myself when I left Stanford to go to law school that I was not going to go silent as a writer. And but that's a hard pledge to keep. I was lucky enough to publish a book about law school while I was in law school called 1L that had been success and gave me a little bit of a beachhead in the publishing world. But I decided to practice law and try to write. And the only time I really had to write was on the morning commuter train. And so I would write longhand on in spiral notebooks, most of them borrowed from my daughter, and and that's how Presumed Innocent began. And that all of that issuing from that epiphanal moment in 1982 where I decided, okay, I'm going to write about crime. I know it, and more than that, it grabs my guts every day, all
And
the
it,
complexity of it.
yeah, I think it clearly grabs the gut of a lot of people, which is why you have so many readers. Where did the idea for this particular book come from? Did you have experiences of your own that might have led you toward writing this one?
Well, as I talked about, the concepts were there. Um, People have commented on the similarities, which I do not deny, of Aaron's situation early in the book and that of Gabby Petito, young woman I believe she came from Pittsburgh, who was sadly murdered by her boyfriend. And some of the facts of the Petito case and May's murder are similar. But and I don't. You got to start somewhere.
Yeah,
And life,
absolutely.
and life very often, offers you the benefit of something that really occurred. So you don't have to sit around wondering, well, is this going to be convincing? Because at least the author starts out convinced that this could really happen because, as in the Petito case, it did. But very quickly, and this is part of the joy of writing fiction, is that it becomes something else. It gets transformed or transmogrified, however you want to put it, and it enters your own imaginative world, and you begin to spin out um, things from it. And so in the Petito case, the accused boyfriend ended up killing himself, whereas Aaron comes back and stoutly maintains his innocence, despite the fact that, there's a good deal of evidence against him, which of course has been augmented by the eagerness of the victim's family, her prominent family, as you mentioned, Diane, to see him prosecuted. Um, and the native presumption that exists, particularly in this rural county where only 1 in 50 people is black. They're very eager to believe that the black kid did it, and all of that is sort of why I refer to Aaron as having been presumed guilty.
This is also something a love story between um, B and Rusty. And it's a lovely one because Rusty seems to have grown and learned from his prior marriage. His wife had died. And B respects her former husband, but doesn't have all that much to do with him. On the other hand, each of them learns something about the other totally, totally unexpected.
Right,
And,
right.
and what marriage doesn't have those kinds of revelations that are really stunning and sort of, in some cases, break up a marriage, or in others, where people can find themselves struggling to keep a relationship going. They manage to get through it.
Well, for Rusty, and he talks about Aaron. He talks with Aaron about this when Aaron is talking to him about May. There's this sense with which he came north after fleeing Kendall County that, he's responsible for having messed up his life, done great damage to his ex-wife and a couple of other women along the way. And suddenly he finds himself in a relationship with a woman who he basically says to himself, had he been smarter, um, this is the woman he should have been yearning for always. And he sees the trial of Aaron as presenting a grave risk to that relationship. Because for B, if he tries the case and Aaron is convicted, sentenced to a lengthy prison term, he'll always have had a hand in this incredible tragedy. And he thinks with good reason that that's going to end up putting an end to their relationship. On the other hand, as Rusty's son, Nat, who readers met as a 10-year-old and presumed innocent, now a grown man with, a family and, an enduring marriage of his own, he says, look, Dad, I understand what you're afraid of. He said, but I think if you don't represent Aaron and he's convicted, then you're really always going to be blamed because B would have figured that you would have done better. And if you have to choose one path or the other, this is probably the right one. If your only concern is preserving your relationship. The fact, though, that Rusty is trying to find the path that'll do best about preserving his relationship illustrates the fundamental conflict that he's got in representing Aaron, which is it's almost impossible for him not to put his own interests ahead of his clients.
Of course. Here's a question from Andreas. These days, do you think you'd be able to practice law? And if so, would you be a better prosecutor or defense attorney?
Well, I retired from commercial practice in 2020. So I did it for a long time in answer to Andreas's case.
Yeah.
And as much as I enjoyed being a prosecutor, and particularly an assistant U.S. attorney in the Chicago office, which was just a superb place to practice law. I was surrounded by talented colleagues and U.S. attorneys who all expected us to do what we thought was right. Over the years, I just found being a defense lawyer more agreeable because being a defense lawyer fundamentally calls upon your abilities to understand and even to forgive your clients for their errors and to uh, practice was saying, "There, but for the grace of God, go I."
But do you have to believe in that client's innocence?
No, I mean I represented innocent people as a defense lawyer, most prominently a man who'd been sentenced to death at one point. And that's just a crushing burden to be responsible for the freedom of someone who's been wrongfully accused, particularly of a crime with a capital sentence. So in many ways, it's easier to represent somebody who, did it. And your job is to do your utmost to make sure that the prosecution proves that guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a lot more agreeable, frankly, emotionally, than having to carry the weight of representing somebody whom you know did not commit the crime and faces, a grave peril in the courtroom.
But did you ever have a client come to you who wanted your representation and you did not take the case because you did not believe in his or her innocence?
I had plenty of clients who told me that they were innocent and who I was skeptical about that, or indeed even absolutely convinced that they were guilty. And in almost all of those cases, they proved to be. I had plenty of clients who said they were innocent, and the grand jury phase in particular, and that bore their claims out. But I didn't think my job was to turn away people because they were not telling me the truth about their innocence or guilt. My job was to put the state to its proof. The only clients that I was reluctant about representing, Diane, and this was my own personal peccadillo, I didn't want to represent people who were mafia affiliated. And there were all kinds of reasons for that, including the fact that it can get dangerous for the lawyer. But most of it was because they were so well heeled that I thought they could find other representation, and I didn't need to. I didn't need to sacrifice my own scruples for that reason. But it was just a personal thing. Most of the lawyers in my firm were not happy with me when I represented accused drug offenders. And I personally, I understand why people have a low opinion of so-called drug peddlers. And believe me, there's plenty of real world basis for that. But that, I regard it as a fundamentally economic crime, and some often with horrible consequences for other people. But
Indeed.
I wasn't reluctant about that. So
Mary wants to ask, what made you want to explore race and justice? As a lawyer, did you see racism play a role in your prosecutions?
well, as an American, and particularly an American of
How
my
can you
age,
help it? Yeah.
yeah, I've always been aware of the role that race plays. And when you enter the typical urban criminal courtroom, this was much more true when I started doing pro bono work than when I was a federal prosecutor, where the most of the cases are so-called white collar crimes where many of the defendants were white. But you see the way crime and poverty in an urban courtroom are inextricably related. And um, it's hard not to be conscious of the role of race in the criminal justice system. And we still have statistics that reveal that, there's a much higher share proportion of African Americans who are convicted and sentenced for crimes than of, other groups, particularly Caucasians. And there's all kinds of reasons for that, including, I'm sure, in some cases, the fact that those defendants don't get a break in situations where white defendants do, whether it's from a jury or from a prosecutor or from a judge. Um, I mean, you know the old saying that America is a country conceived in original sin, and that sin was slavery, and we're still paying the price for it. On the other
Absolutely.
hand, there are elevating aspects of being a trial lawyer. And it's one part of the society, the trial bar, where I've watched the sheer merit of the people who are operating in that world end up to a great extent controlling their fate. And that means that I have seen an incredible number of talented African American lawyers, people who came from very humble origins and reached the top of the profession. And that's the America I believe in.
This would have been a very different novel, however, if Aaron had been white.
If Aaron had been white, yes.
Yeah.
I remember I outlined the plot in a very broad strokes for my editor, Ben Severe. And then about 6 weeks later, I called Ben up and I said, Ben, what would you think if Aaron is black? And there was a long silence at the end of the phone. And, to some extent, writing about people of color by white authors is kind of regarded as kryptonite in today's publishing world. And I personally have no use for that. I think the great risk for a white author writing about black characters is inauthenticity. And if you're inauthentic, then you deserve to pay the price of reader disbelief. But Aaron is just the nature of the crime and the situation was that Aaron was a very isolated human being who's happiest when he's leaving aside May's company occasionally. He's happiest when he's by himself, even in the middle of the woods. And um, to explain that, it occurred to me early on that if he was an African American kid raised in a circumstance where there were very few African Americans around him, that would explain why he felt so isolated. His mother says to him when he's 3 or 4 years old, Aaron, God doesn't think you're different. But there are a lot of people around here who do, and you're just going to have to
But
learn to make your way.
did you get pushback from some who argued that you, as a white man, had no standing to get into the mind and heart of this young black man?
Um, so far, there's been none. I haven't received a single, cavil from African American readers. I've gotten a number of emails from the white parents of who have adopted African American kids.
Mhm.
And they're particularly complimentary of the portrayal of the complexities that arise in a family where these parents love their children without reservation, um, but have to deal with the painful issue of having to say to them, you are different from me. in a way that I can't control.
Here's a question that has to do with politics more than legal writing. It's from David. Do you have any thoughts about how law firms should be dealing with the pressure from the Trump administration not to represent perceived enemies?
I have been very, very distressed by what has been going on with President Trump issuing executive edicts punishing the law firms that dared to employ people who brought actions of one kind or another, almost always against Mr. Trump personally. And I've been distressed by two things. Number one, these actions by President Trump are clearly unconstitutional. They violate the rights of those lawyers to vindicate the Sixth Amendment, which is the right to counsel, the right under the First Amendment to free association, and to some extent, they even may be bills of attainder prohibited by the Constitution, by which individuals are selected for punishment without trial. So that's awful by itself. The reaction of the bar, though, thus far, has been equally distressing.
I
Instead
agree.
of instead of a full-throated cry of outrage from the American Bar Association and local bar associations, we've had everybody's afraid to do anything. And so you have a firm like Paul Weiss, which made what I regard as a incorrect decision to truckle to President Trump and settle with him instead of doing what the Perkins Coie firm did, what I hope Jenner and Block will do, which is to go to court and say, Judge, this is wrong. This can't persist. We need you to instruct the government to remove this executive order, this effective ban on these lawyers from practicing law in the way they always have. And instead, you've had other law firms seek to poach clients from these accused firms, and certainly not, in most cases, lend the kind of support that they deserve because they're but for the grace. And if this is allowed to continue, we will have a system where lawyers are afraid to represent anybody.
Indeed. But what happens if these law firms do take on cases or continue to represent those who have issues with the Trump White House and Donald Trump himself? And those cases ultimately head to appellate courts and then to the Supreme Court. Isn't that why these law firms fear that they'll spend millions of dollars and get turned down by the Supreme Court?
Well, I mean, this Supreme Court has done things that have surprised me. But if they uphold the right of the president to punish law firms by banning them from entering federal buildings or from
Exactly.
getting federal contracts or representing people with federal contracts, I'll be even more shocked than I have been to date. I do not foresee the Supreme Court saying that this is okay, and I, I that's my belief. It may be 5-4, but the Supreme Court won't okay it. The problem, Diane, is exactly the one that you mentioned, which is it's going to be years under this cloud and millions of dollars. And of course, the real purpose of of these executive orders, the clear intent is to keep anybody from representing these law firms or anybody from bringing any actions against the Trump administration. And this will be, I hope, one of the bright moments for the American bar as they continue to stand up to those actions by this administration that are clearly unconstitutional. But we'll see. We'll find out. I mean, um, I recognize that it's going to be very expensive. But Paul Weiss could have afforded the decline in revenue and profits that they would have to endure for a couple of years.
And instead turned over some $25 million to something that Trump wanted them to contribute to. So it seems as though even a firm as big, as strong, as wealthy as Paul Weiss feels afraid. There is fear that's beneath it all, isn't it?
Yeah, and they believe me, I was a partner in a big law firm, and I understand what how that financial pyramid works and the sense that it could all crumble quickly. And there have been firms that have fallen apart with incredible speed. Um, and they're afraid that, the partners with the most lucrative practices will leave. And that, the per partner profits in the firms will drop precipitously. And talented young lawyers won't come to work there and experienced lawyers will leave. I understand the fears. I don't think they're unwarranted, but you can't just talk the talk about the job of the lawyer to defend the weak and unpopular and then refuse to do it when the rubber actually meets the road. And that's why I was particularly horrified by the choices that Paul Weiss made.
And getting back to the novel, a listener says you touch on many cultural fault lines dividing our country, but you seem to suggest that when we actually know each other, we can accept our differences more easily. Am I reading that right? Our listener wants to know.
That is my indelible feeling and the lesson of my lifetime. One of the worst things about segregation, and I'm talking not just about de jure legal segregation, but the de facto segregation of the way many white Americans lead their lives, is that it reinforces those fears that are basically irrational. And we happen to have raised our kids, my ex-wife and I, living next to a couple. It was who were a same-sex couple, and it was really remarkable to me to watch my children come of age with in comprehending the prejudice of some of their classmates against gay people, because my kids had grown up with this lesson that, the next door neighbors were wonderful neighbors. We were
Because
close
they
with that
knew
family.
them. Yeah, they
They
knew
knew them. And so to them to say, there's something bad about gay people and we don't want to have everybody be gay or whatever the mishigas was years ago, they were like, that's nuts. What are they talking about? And so, I think people find that inevitably that when, and that's ultimately one of the things Aaron says in the novel. He says, I I've grown up loving white people. I know how to talk to this jury. And you know, he wants those people to know him. Um, and I understand that. I think that he's right. Um, you know, it
There's
turns out,
there's only one black juror
right.
on this jury. And it's so interesting, as Rusty, you describe, tries not to be reading the jury too obviously. And yet, isn't that what attorneys do when someone testifies and makes a point either for or against the defendant? The attorney really wants to see how the jury is reacting. And you must get awfully sharp at doing that kind of interpretation.
Well, you do, but I mean, I'm laughing even as you're asking this because I can remember my beloved friend Julian Solitarovsky, with whom I tried many cases as a prosecutor. And Julian would just, you know, grab me by the coattail, literally my suit coat, and say, "Stop staring at the jury. They know you're doing it. You're going to make them uncomfortable. Cut it out. Cut it out." So, um,
So that's why in this novel, you're sort of advising young lawyers in a way. Don't pay too much attention.
well, don't stare at them. I mean, if you're
Exactly.
gonna, just if if you see what's going on out of the corner of your eye, that's one thing. But
Yeah.
the jury doesn't like to feel that they're animals in a zoo, and sometimes trial lawyers give them that feeling that they're just observing them, across the rail of the jury box, the way zoo goers look at the animals there.
I asked you earlier whether you wrote this and your earlier novels in a way to teach us, but at the same time, are you thinking about instructing young lawyers, young would-be prosecutors or defense attorneys?
Well, I don't have any doubt that that's sometimes the effect. And when I try to account for the popularity of the books that I've written, I certainly understand their educational elements. But the truth, Diane, is it's that old saw, I'm writing about what I know and what I care about. And I think for any writer, if you're trying to create a coherent, imagined world, and any novelist, um, th- where that's the number one goal, to make the world believable, so that readers can get drawn into it. Um,
We
the
have only a few moments left, but I want to change gears for a minute. You recently wrote an opinion piece about tech companies using your books
yes,
to train AI programs.
yep.
Explain what happened and what concerns you the most about these programs.
Well, I would say generally the attitude of Silicon Valley toward intellectual property has been to um, ask for forgiveness rather than permission, in utilizing what they know damn well belongs to somebody else. And our AI search engines have been educated, using at least two vast storehouses of pirated books. That one called Books 3, one called LibGen.
Huh.
And I just became aware of LibGen the other day when I put my own name into the LibGen widget that had been created by a writer named Alex Reiser. I found every book I've ever written in there, every article I've ever written, including the boring law review articles I wrote, and the editions of my books in several other languages. And this is how they teach AI to think. It thinks in words. And so the more sophisticated its use of language, the better it, quote unquote, thinks. But they're doing no more with these books than human beings are doing by reading, developing the nuances of their understandings of human relations and language. And the idea that they would take these books and not even think about paying the authors it's horrifying. The evidence as it's beginning to emerge is completely, in my view, against them. At least OpenAI has now entered into a licensing agreement with one publisher, which is basically a de facto guilty plea. And I hope that more will follow. But it's why the richest companies in the world need to engage in theft in order to further enrich themselves is beyond my understanding.
And what recourse do you really have?
The recourse has been, in many cases, and I'm a plaintiff in one of these lawsuits, the recourse is to sue and say, give me damages. And don't just give them to me, give them to every author whose work has been illegally utilized in the ways that I was just sort of outlining.
That's pretty scary stuff, that AI can simply pluck. Do they change the language ever
They don't
so?
change. They just strip out everything that identifies the publisher and the author in the Library of Congress number. And the most amusing part of it is a reader wrote me the other day, and he asked AI a question about the relationship between one of the characters in my most recent novel, Before Presumed Guilty. And even though I knew that the AI chatbot had been educated with all of the books that would allow for a proper answer to be offered, it completely bungled it. The question was, who was Pinky's mother? And one answer was Carolyn Polimas from Presumed Innocent, who was the murder victim. So on top of everything else, they steal and they don't even get it right.
Scott Turow, you're wonderful, and it's been such a great pleasure to talk with you again. Are you working on a brand new novel? And
I
will
am.
Rusty appear again?
I don't know what Rusty's future is. I was 15 or 20 years before I went back to him, and I would need to live a very long and healthy life in order to do this again. I also
Well,
have to say, Diane, before we close out, that you're calling me wonderful is very kind, but back at you in several powers. You are a wonder, and it's always been terrific to be with you.
thank you so much. And I hope we'll talk again. Take
Me
care.
too. Me too. Cheers.
And thanks to our listeners as well. Thanks to all the people at WAMU who helped to make these book clubs possible. Before I tell you about my book club selection for April, I have an announcement to make. I am leaving WAMU after more than 50 years, so that next month's book club will be the last coming from WAMU. I'll leave in the beginning of May, so the next and last meeting of the Diane Rehm Book Club on WAMU will be on Wednesday, April 30th, when Geraldine Brooks will join me for a discussion of her gorgeous memoir, Memorial Days. I thank you all. It's been great to be with you, and I hope to see you again next month.